A man, standing in a park at dawn with a red balloon in his hand. No one sees him. No one hears his whisper. But every morning, at the same hour, he comes. He looks up at the sky, as if waiting for something. An apology, a farewell, perhaps a dream left unfinished from childhood. And that day, the wind changes direction. Because that morning, Keanu Reeves is there too. And in that quiet man's life, something begins to shift for the first time. This is the story of a red balloon that rises not to the sky, but to the heart. The city was still asleep as the first rays of dawn filtered through the park. It was a cool spring morning. The air smelled of damp earth. The leaves on the trees trembled gently in the breeze, and a scent of new beginnings lingered. The sleepy chirping of birds mingled with the passing wind, adding a soft rhythm to the park's silence. In the heart of the park, there was a splash of color, a small, weathered stall tied to hundreds of hopeful balloons. The balloons, yellow, blue, red, gleamed defiantly against the pale morning light, swaying lightly in the air, their thin strings tethered to a tree. Standing at that stall was Sami, a silent statue of patience and solitude. Sami was 78 years old. Life had tossed him through many storms, but he'd never quite managed to take root. The deep lines on his face were traces not just of passing years, but of dreams left unfulfilled. And that morning, as he did every morning, he inflated the largest red balloon, tilted his head slightly, and gazed at the sky. "One day," he murmured to himself, his words dissolving like a prayer between his lips. For Sami, selling balloons wasn't a livelihood. It was his way of holding on to childhood. Those balloons were small, colorful reflections of the dreams he'd lost during the war years. Each one carried a fragment of the wishes he'd once sent skyward, only for them to remain grounded. That morning, everything began as it always did. Sami had set up his stall with care. A few families passed by, their children clutching shiny balloons in tiny hands, and Sami responded to each with a warm smile. But within Sami's inner world, every balloon he handed over brought a faint pang, a small sense of something missing. His own balloons had yet to rise. Meanwhile, someone sat on an old bench at the park's edge. Tall, dressed simply, wearing a baseball cap and a brown leather jacket. He was quiet, unassuming, but the air around him seemed to shift subtly. The park's rhythm felt as though it had taken on a new vibration with his presence. This was Keanu Reeves. Known for his humility despite his stardom, Keanu had come that morning seeking only an escape, a break from crowds, flashes and rolls. But here in the middle of the park, among a sky-gazing old man and colorful balloons, he would find something far greater. Keanu took a sip of his coffee, looked up, and noticed the balloons. First, their colors caught his eye, then the strings, and finally the trembling, aged hands holding them. Sami's hands moved with an artist's precision. The care he took in inflating each balloon was like a summary of a lifetime. He tied the strings tightly, yet with each knot it was as if he let go of a piece of himself.
Keanu squinted. This wasn't just a balloon stall, it was a quiet rebellion, the remnants of a small, enduring battle against time.
Sami wore a faint smile, but his eyes were fixed on something far away. Perhaps he was still remembering that hot air balloon from his childhood, the one he'd seen while dreaming with Lael, a childish fantasy that had never quite faded. He'd wanted to soar back then, to get lost in the endless sky, but life had chained him to the ground. As the hours passed, the park grew busier. Children ran around, their laughter echoing in the air. But around Keanu and Sami, time seemed to freeze, as if caught in a moment outside reality. Sami noticed Keanu's gaze. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Sami nodded slightly, out of habit. Most people didn't notice him, and he'd learned to be invisible. But Keanu's look was different. It wasn't judgmental or rushed. It was simply there. A gust of wind blew. The balloons tangled briefly in their strings before separating again. A white cloud drifted slowly across the sky. And in that moment, an invisible bond formed between the two men. Wordless, silent, profound. Keanu, without taking his eyes off the balloons, thought to himself, "Some balloons are tied not to the ground, but to hearts." And Sami, raising the large red balloon toward the sky, felt, for perhaps the first time, that someone was truly seeing him. Keanu didn't move. In a park where everyone hurried by, his attention was fixed on one person. There was something in the old man's movements, a calmness born of having made peace with the past, yet still carrying a lingering regret for the future. It was a solitude Keanu recognized. Despite their age difference, loneliness was universal. You didn't need to speak the same language to understand silence. A look was enough. Years ago, Keanu had stood at a similar crossroads. Early in his career, after losing his father or when his sister was in the hospital, while the world applauded him, a void grew inside. Perhaps that's why, looking at Sami, he saw not just the old man, but himself. Yes, their lives were different, but loneliness didn't care about such distinctions. Just then, Sami lifted the largest blue balloon into the air. It traced a short arc with the wind before settling back down. Sami shook his head slightly and whispered to himself, "It's a bit stubborn today." Keanu heard it. That whisper was a story in itself. He rose from the bench and walked slowly towards Sami. With each step, he felt closer to his own youth. Because sometimes, touching another's wound could heal your own. This was just the beginning. But Keanu knew. Deep down, something was about to change this morning. Keanu rose slowly from the bench. Before tossing his coffee cup in the trash, he paused, his hand on the cup, his eyes still locked on the balloons. His steps were deliberate, yet unhurried. The park's stone paths were slick with morning dew, but Keanu's footsteps were nearly silent on the soft earth. As he approached, Sami's head dipped lower as if embarrassed to be noticed. For years, he'd lived in life's unseen corners. A stranger's attention was almost unsettling. Keanu stopped in front of the balloons. His gaze didn't meet Sami's directly, but lingered on the carefully arranged colors. Each balloon felt like a child's laughter, a tiny memory suspended in the air. The red one floated highest. The blues leaned against each other. The yellows swayed gently in the breeze. To Keanu, this simple stall was like a museum built in a child's heart, and its keeper was an old man. "Do you prepare them this carefully every morning?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but carrying genuine curiosity. Sami, without looking up, spoke as if he'd answered this question 1,000 times. "Balloons are delicate. If you neglect one, the others get jealous. You have to prepare them all. It's all about balance." Keanu gave a small smile at the response. A silence settled between them. A connection had begun, not through words but through intuition. The emptiness inside Keanu echoed with the loneliness in Sami's face. Sami suddenly reached into his jacket's inner pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. Its yellowed edges bore the residue of time. In the photo, a young boy smiled, holding a balloon. Behind him, a hot air balloon rose into the sky. In that moment, Keanu saw the child within the old man. This wasn't just a memory. It was the image of an unfinished dream. "That's me," Sami said. 1949. "The first and only time I got that close to a balloon. But I never got to ride. Then came wars, migration, life. But the dream never left." Keanu, without breaking his silence, studied the photo. He felt that what he held wasn't just a picture, but a symbol of a lifetime of waiting. He chose his words carefully. Dreams don't expire. Sometimes, they're just delayed. Sami looked at Keanu for the first time. Really looked. His eyes were misty, but something stirred within him. Perhaps, after all these years, someone had respected his dream. Perhaps, for the first time, someone saw him not as an old balloon seller, but as a child still longing to soar. What passed between them might have looked like an ordinary conversation to an outsider, but it was the touching of two lonely souls, and in that moment, a spark ignited in Keanu's mind. Maybe Sami's dream could still come true. Life sometimes gives us a second chance. but we have to slow down to notice it. If you love heartfelt stories like this, there's more waiting for you on our channel. Keanu nodded slightly and spoke again. Did you ever get a chance to ride? Did anyone ever come along and say, "Come on, let's go"? Sami gave a wistful smile. I always watched other people's dreams, but no one wanted me along. Then I got old. As time passes, you grow distant not just from the sky, but from yourself. Those words struck Keanu deeply. He'd known loneliness countless times in his own life. The spotlight had made him a figure, but sometimes even in a crowd, he felt invisible. Maybe that's why Sami's voice felt so familiar. A child tugged at his mother's hand and approached the stall, asking for a blue balloon. Sami bent down, handed it over, and the child's face lit up with joy. Keanu smiled. This old man had perhaps spent years giving hope to others while keeping his own tucked away. Sometimes, touching someone else's dream heals the child within us too. At touching moments, we witness stories just like this. Sami folded the photo and slipped it back into his pocket. Some dreams, he said, are lived quietly. They may never come true, but they keep us standing. Keanu stepped back slowly. But that morning wasn't over. A plan had formed in his mind. The sky was still waiting, and sometimes one person believing in a dream could turn a decades-delayed miracle into reality. As Keanu looked at the photo, Sami fell silent for a moment. Then, his eyes lost in the distance, he began to murmur.
A balloon up in the sky carries the child I left behind. Hold my hands just one more time, then gently let me fly to the sky. I whispered a wish into the breeze from the quiet corners of my ears. Let the wind lift these memories high and softly let me go to the sky. Whispered a wish into the breeze from the quiet corners of my ears. Let the wind lift these memories high and softly let me go to the sky.
It was less a song and more a melody of a prayer from the heart. In that moment, those few lines echoing in the park pierced Keanu's soul. The wind paused. The balloons hung still, and everything in the park fell silent. Only Sami's voice lingered, a bridge between past and present. The sun climbed higher above the park. Light filtered through the trees, making the balloons' colors even brighter. But Keanu's mind was no longer on the balloons. It was on the child in that photograph trapped in an unfulfilled dream. Sami's story had said so much without saying much at all. Keanu walked to a kiosk on the far side of the park. He bought a small notebook and a pen. Sitting on a bench, he opened the notebook and began writing in short sentences. Each word solidified his resolve. He'd touched many people's dreams in his life, but this time, the dream he'd reach for was one that had been forgotten, dusted over, but never erased. Hot air balloon, he wrote on, ordinate the first line. Sunset. Silence. A childhood honored. He flipped the pages, jotting down names. He'd research hot air balloon companies in the city, but he didn't want this to be just a gift. It had to be a ceremonial awakening of a dream. Sami needed to do more than ride a balloon. He needed to step out of the shadow of his past and become the hero of his own story. When he returned, Sami was back at his stall, adjusting his balloons. An elderly couple approached, buying balloons for their 3 grandchildren. Sami, with his usual kindness, bent down to the children's eye level and handed them over. The children's laughter filled the park as Keanu watched from a distance. Sami might not have been alone, but he felt lonely. The people around him were fleeting. They took a balloon, thanked him, and left. But no one saw the story behind him. The years, the losses, the waiting. That evening, Keanu used his connections to contact several balloon companies in the city. A few responded immediately. Flight dates, weather conditions, route plans. He reviewed every detail meticulously. The perfect moment would be early morning, when the wind was gentle and the sun was just rising. The hours when Sami gazed most at the sky. Sometimes in life, you don't just surprise someone. You return their past, their childhood to them. If you love witnessing unforgettable moments like this, check out the other stories waiting for you on our channel. The next day, as Sami set up his stall, he found a small envelope. It was tucked under the leg of his stand. He opened it and pulled out a handwritten note. Some dreams are delayed, but they never vanish. Please be ready Friday morning at 5:30 a.m. Location: the sky. There was no signature. Only a small red balloon drawn at the bottom. Sami stood holding the note for a long time. He didn't think or question it. He just looked up at the sky. The wind was gentle, the balloon swaying softly, but his heart, for a moment, beat faster. Was this a prank, or was his dream coming back? Before closing his stall, Sami untied the large red balloon. For the first time, he didn't let it float away. He held it carefully, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Maybe this time I can rise too." Sometimes, changing a person's life doesn't require grand miracles. A small envelope, the right timing, stranger's quiet plan. This story shows how a small act of kindness can transform an entire life. If you love heartwarming true stories, stay with us. That night, Sami left his window open for the first time in years as he slept. The sky had never felt so close. Sami held the note long after reading it. Each letter seemed to carry a voice from the past. The words were simple, but they lightened the weight of years. That morning, there was something different in the park's silence. The usual bird songs, children's laughter, the wind whispering through the trees. It was all the same, but Sami's heart beat differently for the first time. When he returned to his stall, he worked with his usual care. But this time his touch was softer. It was as if he were sending the balloons off to their destinies. As he handled each string, one thought ran through his mind. Can I fly too? The park was busier that day, maybe it was a Saturday. But Sami paid little attention to the passers-by. His eyes kept drifting to the sky. It wasn't the city he lived in anymore. It was the memories swirling in his mind and the approaching miracle. Keanu hadn't appeared that day, but Sami felt his presence everywhere. As evening fell and the park emptied, Sami packed up his stall early for the first time. He carefully lowered the balloons, giving some to children as gifts. But he kept the large red one. It meant something now. It wasn't just a balloon anymore. It was a symbol of the second chance he'd been given. Walking home, his steps were lighter. He carried the envelope in his coat pocket, rereading it every few minutes to remind himself it was real. That night he couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, he was excited to greet the morning. Hot air balloons had always been part of a childhood fairy tale, but this time he wouldn't just watch. He'd be inside one. And Keanu? He was planning the night elsewhere. The arrangements were complete. He'd spoken with the pilot, ensured safety measures were in place. Keanu had shared Sami's photo with the pilot, asking them to greet him specially when he arrived in the morning. 5 a.m, the sky was still a deep navy. A light mist hugged the ground as, in the distance, a balloon began to inflate. Sami buttoned his coat. He slipped his hands into his pockets. His breath turned to vapor in the air. And that morning, the sky looked closer than ever. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the sky had softened into a gradient of gray and navy. A light fog draped the valley, turning the scene into something like a dream sequence. In this open field far from the city, the early morning was filled only with bird calls and the soft whistle of the wind. In the distance, a massive hot air balloon was being inflated. As hot air filled the fabric, it slowly prepared to lift off the ground. Sami arrived at the site early. A private vehicle had picked him up from the city, carrying him in silence. The driver hadn't asked questions, only passed along Keanu's greetings, and driven through the fogged windows. Sami's hands rested on his knees, his face holding an indescribable expression: curiosity, apprehension, and deep gratitude. When he reached the site, the pilots greeted him with respect. They invited him to the balloon's basket immediately, but Sami wanted to watch from a distance for a while. Hands in his pockets, head slightly tilted, he observed the balloon inflating. A part of him still felt like this was a dream he might wake from. Believing that a dream delayed for so many years could become real wasn't easy. And then, a silhouette appeared in the distance. Keanu was approaching with slow steps. His face carried his usual gentle smile, his eyes sparkling with childlike excitement. When Sami saw him, he smiled, truly smiled, for the first time. No thanks, no explanations, just a shared moment when their eyes met, and that was enough. "Ready?" Keanu asked, his voice cheerful but laced with genuine emotion. Sami nodded. "I think this time I really am." With the pilot's help, Sami stepped into the basket, his hands trembling slightly. But the trembling wasn't from age, it was from a long suppressed emotion, rising to the surface. Once he settled into the basket, Keanu joined him. They looked up at the sky in silence. As the balloon began to rise, Sami's heart beat stronger than it ever had. Looking down, he saw the world shrink. Trees, roads, people, they all became tiny figures. But in that moment, Sami felt only the sky. That sense of infinity transformed every dream he'd held onto into a moment of acceptance. "I've never felt this light," Sami said, his eyes glistening. Keanu didn't respond. He just touched Sami's shoulder lightly. That touch held the meaning of 1,000 words. As the balloon continued to climb, Sami pulled the photo from his pocket. The little boy smiled, looking at a hot air balloon in the distance. Now, that boy was truly in the sky. If you believe life is never too late, that some dreams can come true even years later. More touching stories await you on our channel. They didn't speak during the flight. They didn't need to. Sometimes silence is the strongest bond. Sami just looked at the sky. The gentle hum carried by the wind was the sound he'd dreamed of since childhood. This wasn't just a flight, it was a transformation. About 40 minutes later, the balloon began its descent. When Sami's feet touched the ground again, he wasn't the same man. His eyes no longer held just age. They held completion. A life had found its missing piece. Stepping out of the basket, Sami knelt and touched the ground. "Now I'm ready," he said. "There's nothing missing inside me anymore." Keanu approached, and together they looked out over the valley. The sun had fully risen. The horizon glowed golden, and the sky sparkled as if thanking the morning. Sometimes, fulfilling just one dream lets a person make peace with their entire past. That's why we share these stories at touching moments, because some moments leave a mark, not just in the heart, but in life. That morning, the sky touched a man's heart, and a man finally saw the sky. After stepping out of the basket, Sami crouched down. His hands grasped the earth, the slightly damp soil crumbling in his palms. This ground had held him for years, but now that burden felt lighter. His eyes filled with tears, but this time they flowed from inner peace, not sorrow. "I've been waiting for this all these years," he whispered, "but I never gave up." Keanu stood a few steps back, watching silently. For him, this wasn't just a gesture, it was the purest form of humanity. Respect for a stranger's dream had turned into love. In that moment, Keanu said to himself quietly, "When you touch someone's dream, you also heal your own past." The pilots began packing up the balloon. A few birds soared overhead, and sunlight filtered through the mist like a golden veil. Everything felt complete, but there was one more detail. Keanu pulled a small package from his pocket. Inside was Sami's childhood photo, enlarged and framed. Beneath it, a single sentence: "Never give up on dreaming." Sami held the package for a long time. Then he touched Keanu's shoulder. "I'm truly light now," he said. "I have a story to tell. If you've ever felt a void in your heart filled by someone you barely knew, that's why Touching Moments exists." As they left the landing site, the air was still cool. The sky, fresh from the morning flight, felt clearer and more peaceful. Keanu and Sami walked side by side along a dirt path leading up from the valley. They didn't speak. This wasn't an ordinary silence. Both knew words wouldn't suffice. The wind tousled their hair and the gravel crunched under their feet. Along the way, Keanu glanced at Sami's face. There was a transformation in that aged face. The lightness of a man no longer carrying a burden shone even in the lines around his eyes. This wasn't just a flight, it was a cleansing. The what-ifs he'd carried for years had been replaced by a quiet sense of, "It's done." As they neared the city, Keanu led them to a small cafe he'd arranged. It was a quiet, elegant spot, far from the noise. When Sami stepped inside, the smell of wood and freshly ground coffee brought a smile to his face. They sat silently. 2 coffees arrived. For a while, they watched the steam rising from the cups. "Thank you," Sami said, his voice soft but carrying a lifetime of gratitude. Keanu nodded. "We just followed your dream. This was your journey." Sami stared at a distant point. "For the first time in my life, I don't feel indebted to anyone. That's the greatest gift you've given me." Have you ever met someone whose mere presence made you feel whole? Those moments are often hidden in silence. On our channel, we explore those quiet but profound connections. Sami took a sip of his coffee. His hands no longer trembled. "I still have the red balloon," he said with a faint smile. "I'll hang it in the highest spot in my house, where it's closest to the sky." Keanu smiled warmly. "That balloon isn't yours anymore. You are the balloon." Those words sank into Sami's heart. He didn't hide the tears welling in his eyes. He bowed his head, but his face radiated peace. He felt life had paid its debt to him. As they left the cafe, the streets were waking up. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Cars filled the roads. But in Sami's world, time moved differently now. A sense of gratitude blanketed everything. When it was time to part, Keanu headed to his car. But just as he reached for the door, he stopped. He pulled a small note from his pocket and handed it to Sami. "What's this?" Sami asked. Keanu smiled. "For next time, if you have another dream, we'll try again." Sami opened the note. It read, "Dreaming keeps us alive." Below it, the same small red balloon symbol. Every story we tell at Touching Moments is a spark of life, not just a kindness. If this story touched you, don't miss the other videos on our channel. Keanu drove off. As his car disappeared into traffic, Sami stood on the sidewalk. He looked up at the sky. That day, the sky looked different. Because now, it held not just a void, but a sense of completion. And some goodbyes are really new beginnings. Sami watched Keanu's car fade into the distance, lingering in place for a long time. In the city's morning chill, he felt an odd lightness and calm. It was as if he weren't walking on the ground but strolling through the sky. This feeling was even lighter than the balloon he'd ridden that morning. He began walking home slowly. The streetlights hadn't yet turned off. The morning light seeped through cracks in the sidewalk as the city stirred. Sami noticed the sounds around him. A newsstand vendor's shout, the first whiff of fresh coffee from a shop, the distant hum of a bus engine. They all whispered life's rhythm to him. At his doorstep, he pulled out his key. As he opened the door, he paused, taking a deep breath. Stepping inside, his eyes went straight to the old photo on the wall. The boy holding a balloon from his childhood. He smiled. He saw that photo differently now. It was no longer an incomplete story, but a cherished memory of a life fulfilled. That evening, he sat by the window. In his hand was the small card Keanu had given him. Dreaming keeps us alive. His fingers traced the edges as he felt the hope he'd once thought lost, now resting in his palms. He looked out at the sky. He didn't see a balloon, but what he felt was the freedom he'd sought for years. Sami murmured softly, "I'm not afraid anymore." With those words, he made a silent promise to himself. He would live his life as he'd dreamed, and the sky would be his companion. Sometimes, life begins with a small step, and that small step can break a lifetime of chains. If you still carry hope inside, check out the other stories on our channel. Months passed. Every morning, Sami hung his red balloon by the window, sipped his coffee, and watched the first light of day with the sky. That balloon was no longer just a memory of the past. It was a symbol of the hope he carried for the future. Its string was tied tightly to the window, but its meaning grew freer each morning. His neighbors noticed the change in Sami. He used to walk quietly, head down. Now he stood taller, smiled at children in the street, and sometimes shared his story. But the person he most wanted to tell was the man who'd lifted him to the sky that morning. Keanu. One day, he found a handwritten invitation in his mailbox. "We're hosting a small talk for people with real dreams. We hear you have a beautiful story to tell." There was no signature, but a small red balloon was drawn in the corner of the envelope. Sami didn't hesitate. For the first time, he felt worthy of stepping onto a stage. He wasn't just an old man anymore. He was someone who'd followed his dream. And he knew that if he didn't share his story, that dream would remain unfinished. On the day of the talk, he arrived at a small cultural center. As he entered, the crowd watched him quietly. Among them was a familiar face, Keanu sitting in the back, humbly tilting his head, watching him. Sami took the stage. When he held the microphone, his hands didn't tremble for the first time. He took a deep breath and began. "When I was a kid, I'd look at the sky and dream of flying in a balloon, but that balloon never came. Time passed, wars, losses, responsibilities, and my dream grew quiet. Until one morning, a stranger approached me. He was silent, but there was something in his eyes. That look reignited a spark in me that had gone out years ago. And one morning, that balloon finally came." The room was silent, but eyes were misty. Sami continued, "As I floated in the sky that day, I felt complete for the first time in my life. That's why I'm here, because dreams aren't just for the young. And when even one person sees you and believes in you, even the most delayed wish can come true." Every story we share at Touching Moments is sometimes the awakening of a dream, sometimes the healing of a heart. If these words touched you, don't miss the dozens of hopeful stories waiting on our channel. When he finished, applause filled the room. But for Sami, the greatest validation was Keanu's slight nod and smile. In that moment, he knew a bond had formed between them that would last years. After the talk, Sami stepped off the stage. Keanu approached. He said nothing. He extended his hand, held Sami's, and together they walked toward the exit. Outside, the sky was a brilliant blue. A few birds soared, and the sun smiled through the trees. Sami looked up. "I'm not afraid anymore," he said. "I've lived." Maybe you're standing at the edge of a dream you've buried for years. Maybe you need a Keanu in your life. We're here to remind you with every story. Sometimes one person is enough. That day, the sky opened for one man. But that sky now belongs to all of us. The next morning, Sami was at his window, as always. The steam from his coffee fogged the glass as his eyes locked on the sky. But this morning, he wasn't just looking at the sky, he was speaking to it. Silently, with a language from the deepest part of his heart, he pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. It was the one Keanu had given him, with a tiny red balloon on the cover. He flipped through the pages. The first page read, "Write one dream every day from now on." That sentence had become Sami's new life philosophy. That day, he scribbled, "One day, another old man will rise to the sky, and someone needs to hold his hand. Maybe that person will be me." When he set the pen down, a smile spread across his face. Life went on, but it was no longer incomplete. A man who'd told his story now had the power to start someone else's. As Sami walked the streets, he didn't just take steps, he left traces. People stopped him, asking, "Are you him? The man who flew in the balloon? We saw the video." Sami would nod, but the spark in his eyes shone brighter. Dreaming is a beginning, but sharing it is a revolution. If you're ready to write your own story, we're with you as the Touching Moments family. Because every viewer is a partner in a story. That evening, Sami stepped onto his balcony. He held the last balloon and released it into the sky. This time he didn't hold it back. He watched it, followed its path, and whispered, "Go, be the way to another dream." And the balloon soared, vanishing into the sky. But it took root in Sami's heart, just like the beginning of another story.